Tales of Estolia, by Ascelina Kerfman. Volume 1, The Promise of Zacarias. Part 2, The Connection. Chapter 1, All That Might Have Been. Palmyra, 736 years before the current era. Deity loves us. I have no doubts. Our most poignant, most traumatic events lead us to happiness and acceptance, if we are open to the message of Deity in our self and soul. What we are not blessed to receive in this life will be ours in Horizon. If we maintain our faith, and accept the vagaries of chance and free will that might steal some of our happiness during this brief time on earth, we will be comforted by the knowledge of all that will be ours in the fullness of time, and beyond, when our time here upon the planet ceases to be, and the seeds of our earthly existence will sprout an infinity of new worlds wherein time will begin again. Author unknown. Sebastian pulled on his breeches and a tunic, thinking about his plans. Today he was going to store away some of the winter feed in the south barn. Once Dumeril returned, they would begin halter training the newest crop of young horses, one of his favorite tasks. Once dressed, he followed the twisting path from the small cluster of buildings that housed the families of those who worked on Groban's estate. Several women were singing, laughing, and talking, and he paused outside the barn to look towards them. There were three he knew very well: Lucetta, Carlotta, and Violetta were on the edge of the stream, working. He waved towards them before slipping inside the barn. While his eyes adjusted from the bright morning sunshine to the dim interior, his thoughts wandered to Corlia, Groban's daughter. He would see her tonight. She would return from visiting her best friend, Marina. Marina's father's lands were vast, and it took half a day to travel there from Groban's modest estate. Corlia's brother, Dumeril, left to fetch her 3 days before. She had been gone for 2 weeks. They would meet in the summer house. Just thinking about her caused a tightening in his loins. He adjusted his breeches and then, after taking a deep breath, began his work. After several hours, he paused when a rectangle of light indicated that someone had entered the dim interior of the barn. By this point, he was wearing only his breeches, and his upper torso was glistening with the sweat of toil. Groban was a thoughtful employer, always seeing to the comforts of his workers. Someone was delivering water and a light repast. He set aside his pitchfork and used his discarded tunic to wipe the sweat from his brow. It was Lucetta. "Lush, listen, Lucetta." She had a basket with some bread and cheese and a flask of liquid. She waited patiently while he ate. He had sampled her before, as had several of the men who worked for Groban. The light musky scent of her arousal was familiar to him. He tried to block the memory of her skillful touch and mobile mouth. He passed her the basket after he finished eating. She dropped it, and they both bent to retrieve it. It was more than 2 weeks since Corlia left. Her laces were undone enough so that he could see one dark areola peeking at him and the generous swelling curve of her breasts. Without thinking, he reached out and brushed the fabric aside, caressing her. He pulled her into his arms, and she cupped the bulge of his arousal with a feline growl of satisfaction. She was skilled at pleasing a man, and he did not think about anything as she sank to the fresh hay and pulled him down onto her. Sebastian groaned at his release, his hips thrusting several more times until he was fully spent. For a few seconds, he allowed Lucetta to take the bulk of his weight, before he rolled off her and lay on his back, breathing heavily. He was just pulling her to her feet when they both heard a shriek of outrage echoing through the rafters in the barn. As one, they turned to look at the woman standing staring at them in dazed disbelief. "Sebastian." Corlia's voice was shocked. Lucetta hastily stooped to pick up her skirt, pulling it over her exposed body, and then pulled her tunic over her breasts. With a furtive look towards Corlia, Lucetta brushed the hay off her skirts as she turned to slip out of the barn. Sebastian suddenly grasped exactly what it was he had done, and moreover, what he had thrown away. The look of shattered disillusionment on Corlia's face solidified within him. He would give everything he owned if he could go back in time and ignore Lucetta. He recalled one of his father's maxims: "We are the sum of our decisions, the product of our actions, and our character is only as strong as any fabric rent by our falsehoods. Make choices so that your character is strengthened." If his family were still alive, he would be too ashamed to face them. He wanted to hide from Corella as well, but the only thing he had left to give her was his honest acceptance of whatsoever she wished to say or do to him. He must be willing to face the pain he'd inflicted upon her, and the knowledge he had lost her love. He fastened his breeches and brushed stray bits of hay off them before standing straight to accept whatever she wished to say. "Mama said you were not to be trusted." The pain was strumming through her voice. She was breathing heavily, clutching her abdomen. She cupped her hand over her mouth and turned to flee, making it only a few feet before vomiting. He followed her, wanting to comfort her, to tell her how much he loved her and regretted the pain she was feeling. But words were a weak vessel to carry the message seething within his soul. She had no reason to believe him. He handed her a square of fabric to wipe her mouth. "I am sorry, Corella. I do not wish to ever see you again." Each of her words was slow and definitive. In her defiance, she was more alluring than any other woman he had ever known. He opened his mouth to try to plead with her, beg her to give him one more chance. A fierce slap stopped him and he rocked backwards. He wished he could provide her comfort. Physically assaulting him would increase her distress. In fact, anything he did other than honor her wishes would cause her pain. He picked up his tunic and satchel and walked away, forcing himself to not look back. He would not even return to his quarters. With every step he took, he felt the pain of separation grow. As he walked, he sought an outlet for the agony he was feeling by composing a poem. He would record it on the parchment in his satchel. When he finished, he recited it again, setting the rhyme and meter to match his steady pace. It focused his remorse and shame, but also gave him hope. It was his only possession, describing the destruction of his dreams, crumbling into dust as he walked away from the love of his life. Chapter 2. All That Might Have Been. Outside the palace in Anoxes, there was a delightful public garden, an enchanting place I visited often as a young girl, before mother died and my sister was wed. The garden was decorated with statues of fanciful creatures and had a collection of trees from faraway places. One of the trees was called a mayberry and it had year-round lavender-colored blossoms with a most enchanting scent. I was delighted when I discovered that the tree came from Estolia, and I suggested the name to Zacarias. Ensayo of Estolia. All that might have been. 'Tis agony, this cruel event, to finally see the boundaries of morality and integrity. When our choices catch up with us, and those voices within, tease us, torment us with what is, and with what might have been. Irony flavors my every meal, as I dine upon the fruit of my deceptions. The sharpest blade, ne'er sharper than knowledge of what might have been. How can the heart withstand this loss, the cutting pain of sorrow? How can the mind contain the agony of self-inflicted wounds? And oh, how long eternity, when each moment fills with the sorrow of all that might have been. Contemplate your choices. Think. Muse before you choose. Ponder, before you select, or you'll regret forevermore what you can't forget. Now the road to damnation stretches in my sight. Each league I tread upon its length gifts me the view. A view to torment, to tease, to tantalize. To make me see what might have been had I chosen you. The vision of your loveliness flavors each moment of my happiness. The joyous life I never knew, because I chose to dishonor you. I wanted to forget, to end this life, and my memories. But wisdom I needed much earlier, visited me to say that though I seek oblivion, all I reap is damnation, and the memory of my deceit forevermore. Courage to walk this lonely road, to remember my perfidy and your pain as you discovered me. Perhaps no solace awaits in eternity for me, but I must be brave and walk a road of penance. Ne'er will sword, dagger or scythe cut with sharper edge than my deception sliced your tender heart. Oh, the pain of what might have been. And yet, I feel a moment of radiant warmth in this, the winter of my self-contempt. That says to me, Hark. See. Remember your love, her face, her faith, and recall that love attracts love. You will with your beloved be. Perhaps a reconciliation see. Or simple forgiveness, might be all there is for thee. But there is hope, my heart. I say to you, to me, to our future, not written yet. You'll see. Time enough, to mend the rents. To smooth the road to eternity. To embrace the possibilities that I may see the everlasting joy of all that might have been. And still, may yet be. Chapter 2. Everlasting Sorrow. One of the tasks that brought me the greatest joy was compiling all the poetry Estolians wrote over the centuries. Most of it is romantic, written by the men to the women who keep their souls. The most extraordinary thing was how many Estolians wanted their own copy of the compilations. When I asked one woman why, she told me that she wanted to revel in the remembered joy of the words that brought her inspiration, comfort and solace. Tilda Cayley Zacarian, inscrito. Her father slammed out of the house. Corella's shoulders jerked at the sound. Her mother and grandmother were both silent during the confrontation. Corella covered her abdomen with one hand, protective of the life germinating within. She could not hide the swell of her pregnancy forever, her mother guessed that morning when she saw her bathing. Her mother's voice was gentle but firm. It is Groban's right to seek recompense. You must name the father. Papa will have him killed. Corella still loved him, yearning to have him back in her life. Only if he refuses to wed you. Her mother was firm. Wed Sebastian? She wanted that almost more than life itself. Yet the memory of Lucetta, sweaty, with hay in her hair, made her stomach twist up in remembered agony. She could not name Sebastian, could not allow her father to force them to wed. Abuelita, her grandmother, joined the conversation. You must go to see the Divinatra. She alone can decipher the wishes of the 7 deities of Centrath. You are serious? Corella's voice rose in astonishment. The Divinatra claimed to speak for the gods, but had no formal accepted calling. Why would Abuelita, who was very proper and correct in everything she did, make such a suggestion? It would have made more sense if she told Corella to seek advice from one of the Septenatro, the men who were the accepted voice of the gods in Palmyra. Abuelita's lips pursed in distaste. The Septenatro must share all he learns with your papa. He will not keep your secrets. His kind are for the men. The Divinatra will help you. Your brother will escort you, only promise that you will accept what you learn. 3 days later, Dumeril spoke with her just after they broke their fast. Abuelita has commanded that I take you to the Divinatra. A muscle twitched in his jaw, he ground his teeth, and a white line outlined his lips from pressing them together so tightly. Edgar and Alban will accompany us. We will bring a dozen fowl. Abuelita insists it will be enough for the Divinatra. He held the door open, and when she looked at him in query, he added, We leave now, so that father will not know. He will be gone until tomorrow on the eventide. Corella was nervous. Pirates, marauders, and ruffians lived in this region on the fringe of Palmyra, as did the diseased and demented. Dumeril looked around the narrow roads and small dwellings crowded shoulder to shoulder and then looked back at her. This is a bad idea. Inwardly, she agreed, but she was not going to give up. Abuelita made her promise, upon her life, that she would ask the Divinatra her fortune and future and act on it. Her grandmother's directions were vague, but they worked. You will know you have found the Divinatra. You will see a door hanging with a strip of royal fabric, braided with red. It was soiled and short, but unmistakable. She and her brother both dismounted and Edgar took the reins of both horses. Dumeril gestured towards the door. Squaring her shoulders, she looked at her brother again before striding briskly towards the door. A thin hammered metal plate was hanging next to the entrance, with a pair of copla shells braided into another cord. It was a primitive type of bell. She tugged one of the cords and the copla shells clattered against the metal. The response was immediate. A woman flung open the door and pushed aside the inner door hangings. She wore the filth of years like a scarf around her scrawny neck. When she spoke, her breath was overpowering with the stench of decay mixed with garlic. Why seek ye Mathra? Corella did not wish to share her business on this woman's doorstep, but she felt an equal repulsion at the thought of entering the dim interior. I seek my fortune. My future, she recited the words that Buelita told her to use. The old woman looked at her with one shrewd dark eye. The other eye wandered constantly, the iris a milky white. Her good eye darted here and there, taking in her fine garments, her brother standing protectively behind her, and the 5 horses being held by the 2 outriders. The 5th horse had an unwieldy cage tied to its back, with a dozen hens and a rooster inside. Ye think to bribe me with fowl? Corella tried to hold her breath and respond at the same time. I have brought these hens, and the rooster, that I might offer you recompense for the weight of your wisdom. She swallowed down the desire to vomit. The Herodin's nostrils flared and she looked at Dumeril. Thy brother must tarry whilst we converse within. She stepped back and held the door hangings to the side. The room was surprisingly clean. She sat down across from the old woman, allowing her to take her hand. The aged hand gripped hers with remarkable vigor, resisting Corella's attempt to pull it back when the old woman spat into Corella's palm. She was unable to wipe the discolored mass off while the Divinatra reached into one of several grungy leather pouches on the table. She sprinkled a pinch of dried herbs over the viscous lump of spittle, and then folded Corella's fingers down over the palm and the noisome mess. The Divinatra pulled her hand into contact with her withered bosom and began rocking back and forth while tears zigzagged down her face, following the deep creases of extreme age. She whimpered several times like she was in pain, and then finally opened her eyes. Without releasing Corella's hand, the old woman spoke to her. Though there had been no introductions, she knew Corella's name and her family ties. Know ye this, young Corella, daughter of Groban, sister of Dumeril. Ye gain knowledge but no solace in my words. Listen carefully, and ye may discover there is comfort within them. Only ye can say if ye wish this knowledge. I must know. She had promised Buelita. The tufty brows quirked together and the scratchy voice said, A child quickens within thy womb. I have herbs to give thee, to push it from thy body, and to purify thy womb. She sounded cold and unfriendly, gesturing to another leather pouch with indistinguishable dried leaves within. No. Corella did not wish to lose the only piece of Sebastian that she had left. I do not want to lose the baby. The old woman nodded, as if she expected that objection. Thy future be set, solid, unbreakable, unchangeable, the instant I open thy hand. Do you really wish to know? It was a challenge. Yes. Please tell me. She sighed, deflating, no longer looking like a formidable witch. She looked like a frail, elderly woman, not long for this world. She opened Corella's hand and stared at the slimy mass on her palm. Death, I see, the old woman stated in a voice that was warmly compassionate and coldly implacable. Before 3 seasons turn, both of us will walk in the life after this life. The only thing ye can do is bring the father of your child to ye, that he mayst see thee and thy son, before thy death. Corella stared at the viscous spittle and herbs in her palm with a sort of detached horror. Have you no hope, Divinatra, no words of wisdom or comfort? Her voice trembled with the shock of what she was hearing. The old woman gripped her hand hard, pulling Corella's upper body closer, her uneducated, coarse words melted, and suddenly she sounded refined and out of place, here in this humble dwelling. Recall my words, Corella, daughter of Groban. It is a good choice thou hast made. Seek ye out and name the father of thy son. See that he pays penance for his actions. Know that if thou hast the capacity to forgive, thy lover will join thee and together eternity will be thine. Decide. Decide now. I will, she shouted, not even sure what she was saying. The old woman let go of her hand and picked up a large knife, expertly slicing a root vegetable in half lengthwise. She set the cut edge over the slurry on Corella's palm before wrapping a soiled strip of fabric around both hand and vegetable. You will know peace, in the life after this life, if thou hast courage in this life. They both got to their feet before the Divinatra continued, Ye must demonstrate thy faith by leaving thy hand as it is until thou art back upon thy father's land. She escorted Corella back to her door, stopping one final time to say, Thy joy in the next life is limitless, if thy courage in this one wavers not. Chapter 4. Primary Justice. The Isles of Western Centrath held a peculiar influence over the coastal regions of what would, much later, be called Southern Europe and Northern Africa. Izquierdo, in particular, had a disproportionate influence, as it was the center of the lucrative market in human slavery. Territorial disputes and sporadic military reprisals against the slave traders served to obliterate their records. Even the name of the island, Izquierdo, is highly disputed. Cortano, one of the earliest and most infamous slave traders, believed there must be a deity overseeing the affairs of men and, if they did not tender appropriate obeisance, one risked their immortal soul. As he did not know which of the 7 dominant faiths was the correct one, he decreed that all 7 of the deities of Centrath should be worshipped equally. This belief spread throughout all of the settlements whose existence was tied to what we now call the Mediterranean Sea. Only the rise of Christianity usurped the power of this belief. Meredith Zacarian, History of Estolia. Corella was just joining her mother to help with the midday meal when she felt a gush of warmth rush down her legs. Her baby was ready to be born. Your father will get the truth from you now, her mother told her. She pushed aside the bowl of food she had started to prepare and squared her shoulders. The words of the Divinatra kept Corella company these past months. It was time to reveal her secret. She could hear a heavy tread behind her but did not turn. Her voice was heavy with resignation when she admitted to her mother, the baby's father is Sebastian. Her father demanded, What transpires? Our meal will be delayed, my husband. Your daughter is ready to give birth, and has named Sebastian as the father of her child. Corella could not interpret her father's mood when he said, I have asked the Judex Primaria to come with me, to bring him back once his name was revealed. I shall not be gone long. Before she could think about the significance of her father's statement, she was distracted by the force of the pain writhing through her system. Her mother took over, and Corella tried to find comfort in the knowledge that she would see Sebastian before the day was done. Sebastian found himself a job, working in Palmyra at the dock. His attraction to women was gone like the tide. Each morning he promised himself he would be true to Corella, and each night he prayed to the 7 deities, grateful for his success, hopeful that he might someday earn her forgiveness. He was standing on the pier looking out over the water, waiting for a ship that was delivering livestock from Menos. The tread of multiple booted feet on the wooden pier caught his attention. He looked towards the shore. There were 5 men walking towards him. Jerome, his employer, was leading Groban, 2 of his brothers, and a man unfamiliar to Sebastian. Sebastian, this is Alton, Judex Primaria de Palmyra, Jerome introduced the stranger to him. He gestured to Corella's father and added, Groban has laid prior claim to your future. You must go with him. Judex Primaria? The primary justice. Was he to be executed for his crimes against Corella? He inclined his head. He would go with these men, even if it was to his death. It would scarcely begin to pay his debt to Corella. A cart waited for them at the end of the pier. He sat between Corella's uncles, watching the road to her home pass in a daze. He had one hope rushing through his system. Perhaps he would see her again? Every night he had prayed to the 7 deities that he might be given one glimpse of her beautiful face. It was all he could expect to get out of life. He was unlikely to receive forgiveness or her love here in this world. Groban's rigid posture as they continued in silence began to eat away at him. Had something happened to Corella? Fear began to twist through his gut, and he imagined increasingly awful possibilities as they traveled. The only thing that calmed his irrational fears was how unlikely it would be that Groban would fetch him, with the Judex Primaria, in any of the scenarios he could imagine. As the cart entered her father's lands, he felt the unbearable yearning to be with Corella again. He thought of the poem he composed during his long walk away from her. Since then, he did not let a single day go by without saying it during his morning ablutions. At her father's home, the 4 men accompanied him to Corella's bedchambers. What he saw struck fear in his heart. She held an infant to her breast, but she was almost pure white. Blood soaked the rushes beneath her and coated her thighs. "Go to her," Groban commanded him in his ear. Swiftly, he went to her side, his focus on her more than the babe. "He is your son, Sebastian. I named him Corlian," she whispered. "After you. After us." The last word trailed off in a hiss, and he knew, instinctively, that she was gone. He closed his eyes on the pain of being granted his wish, seeing her one last time, only to have her die within his arms. A harsh hand on his upper arm dragged him from the room, out to the blacksmith annex. Sebastian was too numb to object. Groban's voice trembled with anguish. "She named you as father and is now dead. Your seed killed my daughter. You deserve to die." Judex Alton stopped him, saying, "Nay, this is not an equitable penalty." Sebastian felt dispassionate, uncaring as the 2 men dickered over whether he should be put to death or whipped. One of Corella's uncles suggested, "The 7 deities demand that they be arbiters of any transgressor. If we usurp their role, we risk our souls. They must decide Sebastian's final fate." He looked at Sebastian and said, "The punishment must not be to the death, but we must eliminate his ability to visit this same misfortune on others. If we castrate him, he will ever after remember all that he has lost in this his life. If death is the punishment decreed by the 7 deities, they will deliver it to him. And if he lives, he will serve our family until his death." Chapter 5. Naming Day. Justice as a concept, in the ancient world, was constantly evolving. It was about the needs of society more than the needs of any one individual. It was, however, aligned to social status. One could, as a powerful individual, expect more justice than the lesser mortals. In the period of history dominated by the 7 deities of Centrath, in Palmyra, Anoxes, and Cella, justice was relegated to the Judex Primaria, always a man of advancing age who was considered wise enough to speak for the deity of justice in an official capacity. Few citizens, when faced with a verdict from the Judex Primaria, would go against the prescribed punishment and recompense. Eduardo Lestalt, Essay on Religion, Justice, and Commerce in the Ancient World. They waited a week. During that time, Sebastian was kept in the stable in an empty stall. He spent the days praying to the 7 deities, wishing he could go back and rectify his mistakes, but time refused to be altered or coerced. On the 7th day, Dumeril brought him a clean tunic and breeches, waiting while he bathed and dressed. They left the stable together, but he was led towards the cemetery instead of the blacksmith's annex. "Am I to be executed after all?" he asked. Dumeril clapped him on the back and explained, "We go first to the altar, to name Corlian, so that he will be numbered among the citizens of Palmyra. To pray that health, happiness and peace might accompany him all the days of his life. Once accepted by the Septenatro, Father will bless him, declare before the 7 deities that he is to be known, hereafter, as my firstborn son and heir. After the naming ceremony, the men of Groban's estate went to the blacksmith's annex. In addition to Groban and Dumeril, Corella's uncles were present to bear witness to his punishment. Sebastian's eyes had only just become accustomed to the dim interior when Judix Alton arrived with another man who was unfamiliar to him. Groban looked around at the men gathered in the humble blacksmith annex and nodded to himself. He went to the workbench and uncovered a set of earthenware cups and poured a measure of one of his finest spirits into each one. He gave one to each man, including Sebastian. Judix Alton waited until the assembled men finished their drink. When he spoke, his remarks were directed to Sebastian. He gestured to the man who had accompanied him, saying, "This is Devrin. I have asked him to act as the hand of deity, that he might visit your punishment upon you. He is an expert in this procedure." Devrin nodded towards Sebastian and the other men. "Remove your garments," he instructed Sebastian. His next words were not addressed to any one individual. "I will use a substance I call Superren." He pulled a shallow clay pot out of his bag. "With this, we cleanse the region." He listened carefully to Devrin's monologue while disrobing. He was a dynamic speaker, eloquent and direct. Once the flesh is bathed in Superren, calumnon, the pernicious and pervasive spirit of evil and decay, will be attracted to the site. It is attracted to the pure and pristine that it might work to despoil it. Dumeril was indignant. "Why attract calumnon? Is that not usurping the will of the 7 deities exactly the same were we to execute him?" Sebastian removed his undergarments, but was so focused on the information being presented to them, that he was unconcerned at his nudity. Devrin answered Dumeril's question, "Were I to focus only on bringing forth the calumnon to Sebastian's injury, that would usurp the will of the 7 deities, and I would not wish that upon any living soul." He lifted a second clay pot. "Next, we use the essence of asphodel. It is used upon the bodies of the deceased, to smooth the way to the hereafter. Calumnon works only upon the living, having no interaction with the dead. The asphodel encourages his departure, that he might search for the living yet injured, to torment them." Devrin turned to look at him. Up until now, Sebastian had avoided thinking about the punishment that was to be his. He would never know the glory of making love to a woman. His was not the swift justice of beheading. His suffering would extend to many days. Execution seemed kinder. Sebastian was fighting off panic as Devrin and Dumeril positioned him. The panic burgeoned when his legs were strapped to sturdy wooden posts, and his arms were similarly bound. It is instinct that makes a man react when he feels pain or knows that it is about to be delivered to him. You may have every intention of allowing this procedure to go forward, but if you are not bound, you will at some point begin to fight, Devrin explained dispassionately. To his surprise, Groban offered him another cup of spirits. Devrin stopped him and crushed a dried herb into the cup, stirring it with one finger before waving him on. "This will ease your anxiety and calm your fears." After Groban assisted him to drink the now bitter spirits, Devrin pulled out a small wooden box and opened the lid. Within was an ivory-colored powder. "This will take the worst of the fear and render it inert. This is critical, because calumnon is not deceived by the asphodel if fear surrounds the man. Thus we eliminate fear and increase the chance of surviving." Devrin pushed the finger that was still damp from the spirits into the white powder and pulled it out coated in dust. He dipped his finger in a second cup of spirits and had Sebastian drink it. Sebastian's fear receded, replaced by curiosity, as if he was one of the spectators, rather than the one being punished. Devrin bathed his genitals in the first substance before carefully coating the cool pouch of skin with the essence of asphodel. When he saw the knife, his peace began to seep away. Devrin's monologue continued, providing Sebastian with something to focus on. First we must expose the seeds within. A swift stroke is preferable and the least painful. Devrin followed words with action, and Sebastian was shocked by the acute pain that was, nevertheless, nothing like he expected. His breath escaped him on a hiss and he groaned slightly. Devrin's words and actions from this point were swift and decisive. The incision is not the source of the pain, Devrin said. His voice was sympathetic. That comes next. Once both seeds are exposed, they must be pulled forth from the body until the stalk is taut. The desire to vomit was intense, and Sebastian's groan rose several octaves into a half-realized scream. If severed, Devrin continued, his tone now grim, man or beast will bleed excessively and calumnian will be lured back to visit corruption upon the flesh, with death to surely follow. Thus, the only secure and safe method is to apply two forces to the stalks. I have come to appreciate the value in using both simultaneously and swiftly. They must be crushed to eliminate bleeding and only then severed. Sebastian's high-pitched scream of anguish accompanied Devrin's words. Shock and pain combined, and he passed out. Chapter 6. Penance. The meaning of the symbols came to me in the most roundabout way. I was looking at some of Kaylee's correspondence with Tamron, and when I questioned her, she showed me an entry in a textbook that linked the Estolian script to GE's. One of the symbols fairly leapt out at me, and she told me that it meant plan, or design with a modifier that made it the greatest, or grandest. The grand design. I'd almost finished translating Key's inscription over the exit from the medallion room, and the final line, written horizontally for emphasis, instead of the typical vertical script, said, "Beware the grand design." I felt the crawl of fear down my spine. What was Key trying to say, and to whom? Jeremiah Zacarian, in Scrito. Sebastian woke with pain reverberating through his system. It was an apt seasoning for this meal of the ashes of all he destroyed. He could only think about Corella's white face as she told him the name of his son. Dumeril brought him a simple meal. He drank some of the wine, but refused anything more substantial. He had been brought to recuperate in Dumeril's personal quarters. When the next meal was brought to him, he couldn't face the thought of eating. He rejected the rich broth that was offered to him. Dumeril set the bowl down before pulling a stool close to the side of the bed. Once he was seated, he said, "You must eat." "Why?" Sebastian's voice reflected the sickness of soul that had been with him since Corella's death. "Because no man may usurp the judgment of the seven deities, which you attempt when you seek to starve yourself. In faith, you must try to heal, and to heal, you must eat. Have you any other inducement?" He wanted an end to the physical pain throbbing through his groin, and the emotional pain of knowing that Corella was dead. Dumeril pulled the stool closer to Sebastian. "I will raise my sister's son, and he will know me as his father." He pursed his lips and looked thoughtful. "Did you note that she named him Corlian?" "She told me she had." It had seemed unimportant. "In our family, a woman chooses the name of her baby. Combining her name and yours, naming him Corlian was her way of telling you how much she loved you." His eyes met Sebastian's and he said fervently, "My sister's biggest fear was that Groban would have you killed if she named you as the babe's father. Because you do not care to live, you might return to be with her, but only after she sees her deepest fear come true." The thought of causing Corella pain was more than he could bear. "I will eat," he decided. That conversation marked the turn in his recuperation, and when he survived, he often thanked the seven deities for their mercy. What did castration matter when the only woman he would ever love no longer walked this world? What was difficult about serving this family, if he could spend the rest of his life serving his son? In the years since his daughter's death, Groban had mellowed from his first fury when he called for Sebastian's death. He never forgot his daughter, but he accepted that Sebastian's remorse was real, and his loyalty absolute. In many ways Sebastian was treated as if he was one of the family. Once Corlian was weaned, Sebastian slept in the room with Corlian, tending his needs in everything. It was one of his greatest pleasures, even if he was thought of as nothing more than a servant. It was enough that Sebastian knew that Corlian was the physical proof of his and Corella's love. From the time he could walk, Corlian was utterly fascinated by the horses his uncle and grandfather raised. He had a never-ending stream of questions about them. Dumeril planned to give him lessons in horsemanship when he reached the pivotal age of 7 and was ready to learn the skills and responsibilities of young men. He had not yet celebrated the 5th anniversary of his birth when Groban's family welcomed Corella's best friend, Marina, and her father Galen. They brought a beautiful gelding, half the size of a normal horse, with them as a gift for Corlian. The miniature steed would suit Corlian until he reached the age of 7. Working with Corlian, serving him, and doing what he could to enhance Groban's home were all second nature. He cherished Dumeril's friendship, their companionship alleviated some of Sebastian's loneliness. As Corlian neared his 5th birthday, the precarious happiness Sebastian enjoyed was ruptured. He was tending to the hooves on one of the draft horses when Groban came out to see him. "Sebastian," he said, "when you are done, come out and speak with me." He finished with trimming the hoof and then went out to the spreading oak tree where Groban sat on a bench that Sebastian had built in his free time. He did not like what he saw on Groban's face. Dumeril will be joined with Marina during the solstice festival. They will live with her family, and he is to take over Galen's estate. My estate will go to my brother's sons, who will be coming to live here after the festival. It was a sensible arrangement. Marina was the only child of a very wealthy landowner. It was an advantageous alliance between the two families. Groban sighed heavily and settled one of his hands on Sebastian's shoulder, when he added, "Dumeril thinks of Corlian as his firstborn son. Corlian will move with him to Marina's home." Sebastian was never acknowledged as Corlian's father, but he loved his son with all the pride and fervor of any other father. He kept his expression bland, but felt as if the structure of his happiness was being shattered. Lifting his chin, he said firmly, "I am pledged to serve your family until the day I die." "Yes, Sebastian. I appreciate your undying loyalty. I felt it was only right to tell you what was going to happen once the decision was made." Chapter 7. Letting Go. I sometimes wonder, as I read the capítulos and ensayos, about the events surrounding many of the Strellaran. It is almost as if there is some music to the cosmos and our life is the dance that goes with the tune. As if some celestial choreographer directs our choices and challenges, creating a thing of both beauty and functionality. Cassiopeia, in Scrito. The 5 weeks until the solstice festival went by too fast. Before this time, Sebastian took his son's presence in his life as one of the few constants upon which he could rely. Soon, however, his life would be a wasteland, living and working for Groban, while his best friend and his son lived too far away to visit casually. A full day of journeying. The only happiness he would be granted would be the occasional brief visits and, once Marina quickened, even those visits might be shortened or eliminated. He prayed often to the 7 deities, begging for their mercy, for the chance to be with his son. Each time, he could feel the answer within him. He would not be granted his wish. Instead he would be cut off from his son. This, then, was his true punishment for his younger years, bedding as many women as he could and boasting of his conquests to other men. The day before the festival, Sebastian and Dumeril went on a boar hunt. Normally fraught with risks, the hunt was swift and successful, a powerful omen foretelling the success of the nuptials. When they returned, the women had created a ground oven to roast the boar for almost a full day. The marriage would be at dawn, and the feast before midday. Dumeril and Sebastian remained at Groban's estate the night before the ceremony. They would prepare by candlelight well before sunrise, and when ready, would ride the 2 cart horses that would be used to pull the carriage bringing the couple to their new home. Sebastian helped Dumeril to dress. The 2 men went out to the stable, to the horses that were prepared for them. Before they mounted, Dumeril put both hands on Sebastian's shoulders, and said to him, "Thank you, for being my friend, for your loyalty, for everything you have done for my family. I shall never forget all that we owe you." Sebastian swallowed down the emotions burgeoning within him. He gave Dumeril a leg up into the saddle before mounting his own horse. The moon was full and the pathway well lit, and they arrived just as the first pink streaks of dawn began to stain the sky. The smell of the feast being prepared wafted lazily in the dawn air as the couple were joined. The 7 deities were generous that morning, painting a glorious backdrop to the ceremony as the sun burst over the horizon. About an hour after the midday feast, Sebastian was sitting in the shade with the new couple. Dumeril was focused on his new bride and frequently lost the thread of the conversation. His cousins were teasing the newlyweds, and laughing at the rise of a blush on Marina's cheeks. "Papa! Come see the funny fish," Corlian yelled as he ran to where they were all seated in the shade. He was hopping up and down in urgency and several other boys were waiting. Dumeril looked up briefly, clearly unwilling to spend much time away from his new bride. "Can you show it to Sebastian?" Corlian's response was to grab Sebastian's hand and start tugging. Once Sebastian began to follow him, he skipped ahead with the other boys following his lead. Sebastian reached the wooden pier in time to see Corlian lose his balance and pitch headfirst into the water at the end of the pier. Like all of the children in Palmyra, he could swim. But there was a treacherous riptide in the water off the end of the pier when the tide was going out. Sebastian yelled Corlian's name before sprinting to the end of the pier. The riptide was active. Corlian was already some distance away from the pier. He dove into the water, swimming with the current. A gurgling cough oriented him. He saw the flash of Corlian's face before he was pulled back under the surface of the water. The current was dragging him towards the sea almost as fast as Sebastian could swim. Sebastian was exhausted, but he could not give up. He would die if Corlian died. He had to save him. Putting all his power into the effort, he surged towards where he last saw Corlian. When he felt the brush of warm skin against his fingertips, he grabbed whatever he could, yanking the small body to the surface with him. Once on the surface of the water, Sebastian ignored everything but the still body in his arms. He wasn't breathing. Some faint memory stirred in his mind. And he gave him his own breath. Sebastian could have wept when Corlian started to cough. Only then did he notice his surroundings, seeing another danger. The swift current would soon sweep them out to open water. They were almost at one of the 2 spits of land, like arms embracing the bay. Sebastian's legs were leaden as he tried to swim to the closest shore. When he felt the brush of sharp rocks against his foot, he redoubled his effort, his breath coming in heaving gasps by the time he pulled Corlian up onto the sand with him. Groban and Dumeril arrived riding a couple of the cart horses. On the opposite spit of land, Groban's brothers were on the other cart horses. When Dumeril took Corlian into his arms, Sebastian understood that he was superfluous to his son's life. He looked away and met Groban's eyes, seeing compassion. He knew what it was like to lose a child. "I made my father promise, Sebastian, that if you were able to save my son, you would be freed of your obligation to our family. We are both grateful for your quick thinking on this day." Dumeril's voice was thick with the tears he was unable to suppress. Sebastian wanted to reject the offered freedom, to stay with his son. But he felt a prickle of sensation down his spine. One or more of the 7 deities was telling him that he must go. He nodded solemnly. "I shall ever be loyal to your family." They shook hands. Dumeril said, "Accept the freedom that is yours. Know that Corlian will be cherished and loved as if he was my very own. No son will matter more to me than he already does." Chapter 8. Corlia. 721 years before the current era. To transform Estolia from an uninhabited island into the paradise we know nearly 3,000 years later, took an equal measure of both deity and luck. Looking back, it seems as if those events happened in a systematic pre-planned progression of fortuitous coincidences. Rationally, however, the first immigrants were fleeing poverty and servitude, seeking their fortune, and fertile fields not yet claimed by the wealthy and powerful. In addition, craftsmen, herd masters, workers of metal, stonemasons, and the seafarers whose passion was the beating heart of Estolia, these all found their way to Estolia's shores. Those who came to Estolia learned of the promise that Zacarias made to deity and embraced the Estolian faith. Meredith Zacarian, History of Estolia. The small fire crackled merrily. Sebastian stared into the flames and reflected on the time since he left Palmyra. 10 years had elapsed since Groban released him and gave him his stallion Migo. Since his arrival on the small island, he always made certain he faced the direction of the rising sun, looking across the intervening water towards Palmyra, the land that held all that was dear to his heart, Corlia's final resting place and his son. He came upon this island during his most recent adventure. He'd been hired to tend to the needs of 10 mares. Transported from the farthest reaches of Centrath, they had been escorted by a handful of individuals. Sebastian was hired to escort the mares to the royal stables in Anoxes. A gift from one man in power to another. The island's inhabitants were goats, sheep and wild horses. The horses on the small island resembled Corlian's first steed, short in stature, but in all other ways perfectly proportional. He named the island Corlia, in honor of his son. It was a privilege to see to the needs of the broodmares. Their value, in the mind of Shikan Sharon, was beyond price. For the royal stablemaster of Anoxes, they were a peculiar obligation he was required to humor. On the third day of the journey, the captain's disdain for equine transportation, and horses in general, became apparent. The feed was moldy and caked in the feces and urine of rodents. Sebastian confronted the captain, but his concerns were ignored. His insistence did eventually elicit a response. Migo woke him, and it took him several minutes to figure out what had happened. The sweet breath of the stallion filled his senses as his equine companion nudged him, trying to get him to stand up. He climbed unsteadily to his feet, leaning heavily on the stallion. Migo moved closer, whickering in concern even as his muscles bunched to help support Sebastian. He recalled the captain punching him. The captain and another man had dragged him to Migo's stall, and then, seeing the whip amongst Sebastian's possessions, the two men took turns whipping him until he passed out. His jaw was broken. It was a full week before Sebastian could tend his charges. When one of the mares lost her premature foal and died shortly thereafter, he came to a decision. They were passing by a small island where Sebastian chose to risk everything. He led the mares, weak from starvation and dehydration, to a break in the deck rail. With a quick prayer to the 7 deities, he urged the frightened mares into the water. He was just leading Migo towards the rail when the captain stepped out of the bridge. He crossed his arms and leaned back, his teeth flashing in the light of the full moon. Without hesitation, he mounted Migo, and urged him into the water. On Palmyra, Sebastian sought out Devrin once he healed, so that he might learn everything he could about the substances used on him, asphodel and calumnin, and he became expert at treating injuries, especially his own. The healing skills he learned were essential in the aftermath of his recent mistreatment. He would remain for a season, heal from his wounds, and recharge his soul. He had learned, over the course of the years, to accept physical pain and set it aside. He had been alone on the island for more than a full cycle of the moon, and had found a measure of peace in his solitude. He tossed some pine cones on the fire, harvesting the pine nuts absent-mindedly as he leaned back against the grassy hummock. Corlian would number 15 years on the next day. Sebastian could only imagine what his son's life was like. He would have 2 or 3 siblings by now. Dumeril would be teaching him everything he knew about horses. One of the pieces of wood in the fire broke, sending up a miniature burst of sparks. He clenched his jaw, remembering that Corlian was Dumeril's son. His son would not remember him. The sky was clear and the stars looked like gems sparkling in pure, undiluted darkness. The jeweled expanse led him to muse about wounds. The stars might be considered wounds to the darkness, an interruption in the preferred state of being. The night sky, being infinite, must therefore have infinite wounds to contend with. He chuckled to himself. He was no philosopher. Unlike the night sky, he had but 2 wounds to his soul: Corella and Corlian. More than once he dreamed of conversing with deity, and learning that Corella would wait for him in the life after this life. Corlian was living, and in a few years, most likely loving in Palmyra. He could probably return to Palmyra and see his son. But, even if he could secure passage back to the land of his birth, the gap that separated them was insurmountable. Corlian thought of himself as Dumeril's son, and Sebastian had to accept the final barrier, the one he could not overcome. It was the will of deity that he seek his son only in the life after this life. Until that time, he would live his life in the service of the 7 deities of Centrath. "You have been very faithful, Sebastian," a female voice spoke next to him. For just a moment, he thought he was seeing Corella. But it wasn't her. It was a stranger. The moon was just rising, and her hair was a light color. The details of her features and garments weren't visible in the darkness. "I am deity, Sebastian. I commanded that you must leave Corlian. Do you regret the years since?" Deity? Unable to decipher his thoughts or feelings. "Perhaps, Sebastian, it is a courtesy. I could look within, but I do you the honor of asking you to share with me." His heartbeat accelerated. She must be deity. She could see within his heart. What had she asked? Did he regret the 10 years since he last saw his son? "I have traveled far, learned much, become more than I would have been had I remained. I feel an emptiness within me. Like a tooth that aches but becomes an expected companion, always with me. Would I trade the last 10 years for those same years serving Groban? No. I have found great peace within myself for who I am. This life is not so long, I will be with Corella again. I wish more of you, Sebastian, than you have so far given." "How may I serve you?" The time he spent here, in the land he called Corlia, had been a time of peace and rejuvenation. A time to get to know himself more than he ever had before. But it was a time of solitude. He could not remain here indefinitely. Her tinkling laughter reverberated through the night, but she did not share whatever amused her. To the southwest is a rocky strait. Impossible to navigate in a vessel that plies the water, but you and your stallion can cross it. If you turn to the south and travel along the shore as it curves to the west until you come to a purple river, you will find that your services, as my servant, are needed. He thought about her words for some time. Finally, he turned to ask her a question, only to find that he was alone. He lay down and closed his eyes, thinking about the woman, the deity he had just conversed with. She had read his mind, responded to him as if he spoke aloud. He had to believe. On the morrow, he would seek out those who required his services as a servant of deity. When they finished fording the impassable rocky strait that separated Corlia and the larger island to the west, Migu tugged frequently at the reins until finally Sebastian felt constrained to give him his head. For most of the morning they alternated between a canter on the smoothest terrain to a ground-eating trot on the rougher parts of the seashore. Long after he would have rested his stallion, the animal kept up the grueling pace. Was deity providing the stallion with the stamina required to complete this task? With the sun balanced on the edge of the world, surrounded by clouds kindling in the reflected glory of its brilliance, the impetus seemed to drain away, and they halted to watch the celestial show. That night Sebastian slept well, comforted by the sound of Migu grazing. The sun was still below the edge of the world when he woke to the nudge of Migu's nose, urging him awake. After his morning ablutions, he mounted the stallion and they continued their journey by the light of an almost full moon. The sun was just peeping over the horizon, lighting up the new day, when he discovered the purple river. On the far side was just a barren shelf of land teeming with big seabirds and very little vegetation. To the south was the outlet to the sea, which left only one direction to travel, upriver, to find those who had a need of his services. The sky was still painted with the muted colors of sunrise when Migu pushed through some brush and Sebastian spied two people enjoying the glorious colors of the fading skies. He called out a greeting to them. These were the individuals whom deity asked him to seek out, the ones who required the services he could provide. The man spoke to him in Enochian, the language of commerce in Western Centrath. The sun was not far above the horizon when Sebastian formalized their union. Zacarias and Estoliana were their names, and by the midday meal, they had invited him to make his home, permanently, in Estolia. Chapter 9. The Written Word. 690 years before the current era. When I began my acolyte year, I thought I would be immersed in the words of Zacharias, the wisdom of Amador, and the courage of Zacarian. I expected to quench the thirst for knowledge that was within me from a young age, and to sup on the banquet of words left by my forebears. I anticipated guidance in my journey of discovery, and sustenance to satiate my hunger for spiritual nourishment. I hoped to receive answers to the many questions that plagued me, and instruction in how to find these answers myself, so that I might embark on a lifelong campaign of enrichment for self and soul. I thought to strengthen my grasp on all things taught in the capítulos, to take this knowledge with me into Torizon when my time came, and use it as both guide and guardian of my eternal quest for truth. The reality was nothing like I imagined. Jeremiah Zacarian, in Scrito. Zacarian yawned. When he finished, he grinned towards Amador. The stallion that stood next to him pawed the ground, as if impatient for the sunrise to commence. On cue, the sun tipped over the edge of the world, throwing the dragon spines at the top of Mount Zacarias into bold relief. Both young men focused their attention on the glorious vision of the sun bathing their land in beautiful color. For the two brothers, the reverence with which Sebastian, Key, and their father watched the sun rising, left behind an indelible impression. Once the sun finished its glorious performance, Sebastian led them over to a natural arrangement of broken dragon spines. Sometime in antiquity, several of the spines had toppled and the result resembled a table with bench seats to either side. Zacarian and Amador had lessons over the years in this spot. While they had watched the sun rise, Sebastian prepared the table so that they could break their fast and have another lesson. The two men listened while Sebastian recounted some of the earliest history of their land. Zacarian had heard much of what Sebastian was sharing, but he never grew tired of listening to him. Before leaving Palmyra, I learned how to create and use the soaps of cleanliness from the most gifted healer I have ever known. Once Mari came to Estolia, she and I spent time together, combining our medical knowledge and refining and honing our respective medical skills. Key wrote your father's words along the sides of Mount Promessa, but he was not happy to do so. When I asked him why, Mari explained that Key understood each stone, each rock as if it was alive and unique. The stone of Mount Promessa, like the mountain itself, was old and weathered. It would be unable to hold his inscriptions very long, they would crumble to dust. It was critical to his art, and for the purpose of recording Zacharias' word for all time, that he find the type of stone that would accept his work, and be capable of holding it pristine until time ceased to be time. Sebastian gestured towards the food, and all three were silent as they ate. After their meal, Sebastian asked, "Can you explain our early history?" Amador glanced at his brother before he cleared his throat and recited, "You and Key worked with other Estolians to create and refine the written language. Key came from the land of the pharaohs, you came from Palmyra, mother and father came from Anoxes, and others came from Chella. Since each of you came from different cultures with different languages, the written language that you and Key developed was unique to all of Centrath. For the next several hours, Amador, Zacarian and Sebastian discussed the early history of Estolia. Key and Mari moved into the Temple Mountain once the Amador region was settled, and Key happily spent his time inscribing the words Zacharias shared with him. Zacharias wanted the breadth of his experiences transcribed, his promise to deity, and deity's promises in return. Key recorded everything in the stone walls of the natural chambers of the labyrinth of Mount Estoliana, the same words he once unhappily inscribed on the sides of Mount Promessa. During a break in their instruction, Zacarian left Amador and Sebastian debating some minor detail regarding the language and went over to the horses, offering the 3 mounts each a handful of grains. While they munched, he remembered the time when he was 18 and Amador was 16. Sebastian tried to explain to their father how to use the new language that had been developed. Sebastian was teaching Zacarian how to create a black ink to write on parchment, and the process of developing and using dyes fascinated him more than the idea of using the dyes to record one's thoughts and daily activities. He was focusing his attention on the different ingredients of the dyes when his father joined them. Mari interpreted for Key, and explained, the writing of the pharaohs, which Key learned as a young man, can be written vertically or horizontally. While Mari spoke, Key showed them examples of both. Some scripts are only horizontal, like that of the Septenatro of Palmyra, from right to left, or that of Nubians, from left to right. Key believes that only vertical writing is logical, like the fall of water into Lake Eternity. He demonstrated on a strip of hide using the ink that Sebastian had just finished making. Once the demonstration of writing was finished, his father said that he felt the heft of deity in each stroke, each symbol, every mark upon the hide, but he couldn't read it. Zacarian didn't think his father would ever read it. When he tried, he could not see the differences in the symbols, and he could not reproduce any of them faithfully. Amador learned the skill of reading and writing as if he required it to breathe. For Zacarian it was not quite that simple to learn, but after much study and practice, he felt as if his skill was no less impressive than his brother's. "Do you wish to show me the archives?" Zacharias asked Key. Mari answered, "He says you will see and admire his work, but it will not be during his lifetime. He has had a vision that his creation, the written language of Estolia, will be used far beyond that time when there is nothing of his body left on this earth, not even the dust of his bones. There is a greater permanence in this world in having his creation survive longer than his physical body. And there is the promise of Torizon wherein his body will be whole, his voice will be recovered, and we will live as one into eternity." Sebastian waved off the 2 men who had accompanied him to the top of Mount Estoliana for instruction. As he returned to the small dead-end cave that he had called his home for the last 25 years, he recalled the summer of his 10th year living in this blessed valley. It was on a day much like this one. He settled on the grass under the cluster of mature mayberry trees near the entrance to his home. Chewing a stalk of sweetgrass, he lay on his back, staring up at the sky. That day, 15 years ago, he watched the clouds scud across the sky. He relived the events of that long-ago afternoon. It was 30 years since his son's birth, 15 since he met Zacharias. If Corlia was Estolian, he would be preparing to wed his Kaylee. Most men in Palmyra wed much younger. Likely Corlia already had a child of his own. Sebastian sighed heavily and closed his eyes. Shutting out the beautiful azure sky, the clouds, and the perpetual mayberry blossoms. One of the things that continued to haunt him was all the might-have-beens. If he had been true to Corella, and if they were wed, would she have had the courage to fight to survive the harrowing birth? Dumeril told him, on Corlian's first birth anniversary, that Corella went to see the Divinatra. She told Corella of her impending death. At the time, Sebastian wasn't properly listening to Dumeril, but he thought about it now. Was it possible that he would have known great sorrow even if he had remained faithful? Was there never any hope for happiness upon this world for the 2 of them? Have you not known happiness here in Estolia, Sebastian? A familiar soft voice asked. His eyes snapped open and he saw her, sitting under the mayberry tree opposite him. "Deity," he said, his voice a hiss of recognition. She smiled, a little sadly. Waiting. She had asked him a question. "Yes, I have known happiness. I just wish I knew that Corlian was happy. I wish I could share with him all that Estolia is. And..." He broke off. "And you yearn for your Corella," she finished for him. Her eyes flicked away from him before returning. "For you, Sebastian, a gift, to warm your heart, and to seal the promise you made to her, and that she made to you." A warm hand on his shoulder had him turning slightly. Corella. Looking at him with all the love he'd extinguished so long ago. He pulled her into his arms, holding her warm, young vibrant body against his own. When he finally pulled back, and looked into her peat green eyes, he said to her, "Forgive me. No woman has ever held my heart but you, and no woman has touched my body but you, since." She covered his lips with one hand, her voice gentle. "I know, Sebastian, I know. I wait for you. Here in Horizon, and then we will be together, forever." Chapter 10. Talents and Gifts. Jealousy, greed, avarice, gluttony, slothfulness. The darkest of human characteristics have influenced the progress of humanity in countless ways. Historians underestimate their impact on the course of human events. Within Estolia, the leadership would like to believe that the nation is free of these motives. They crop up everywhere, including Estolia. Percival Zacarian, Capitulo 83. A few months before Zacarian's birthday, he and Amador accompanied their father to the top of Mount Zacarias, to tour the future site of the palace. It sometimes surprises me how different the two of you are. I am proud of both of you, and yet I am somehow closer to Amador than I am with you, Zacarian. I wonder why that is? Zacarian felt a burst of warmth in his chest. It does not surprise me, Father. You have spoken directly with deity. You have established both a faith and a nation. You are a prophet. He put an arm around his brother's shoulders. Amador represents your spiritual side, your true nature. It is clear that you love both of us equally, Father, Amador added, but you do not love us the same. I suppose I do not. Zacarias smiled from one to the other. The greatest joy I have, after Estoliana, is in knowing everything that blesses my life now will be there to bless yours and your sisters' lives, and the lives of your children. Amador gestured to the smallest of the dragon spines that were all that was left of the original peak of Mount Zacarias. Come, Father, see what Key and I have created. Shortly after they relocated inland, Amador began to carve a large wooden stump of a tree. When Zacarian asked him what he was doing, he explained that he was designing the palace. By the time Zacarian was 20 years old, his brother's model was complete. Amador and Key spent the intervening 10 years working on many aspects of the massive project. One finger of rock on the top of Mount Zacarias had been carved and prepared to become the grand entrance to the palace. It was one of Key's masterpieces. It was a grandiose double staircase rising 3 full levels to what would, one day, be the entrance to the palace. As with the entrance to the temple, which had 2 massive felines on either side of the entrance, Key carved 2 similar, if much smaller, felines flanking the steps. The staircase stretched between the 2 statues, rising for 10 shallow steps before splitting to march upwards to right and left, curving around a natural declivity in the rock that Key used to bring Amador's vision to life. There were benches around the periphery, and on the broad wall of rock, viewed by anyone climbing the first 10 steps, was the Estolian flag carved into the rock face. It was as tall as a man, and with a width nearly twice his height. Zacarias admired both the flag as well as the small area suitable for a gathering of 6 or 8 people. The flag had 2 mountains and 8 stars. 4 between the 2 mountains, and 2 each to right and left. Beneath the flag was a banner with words cut into the stone. Zacarias brushed his fingertips over the inscription and asked, "What does it say?" Amador did not respond right away. When he did, his voice was less certain. "Key tells me that it is Nubian lettering. Our script has many similarities to theirs. It means keep the promise. Key said it would enable those in the future to unlock the secrets of our nation." Zacarian asked his brother, "Will you, also, speak with a shadow on your tongue, your meaning obscured by portents and prophecies?" Amador merely shrugged in response. But Zacarian read the truth in it. He could not answer the question, but if it was what deity demanded, he would obscure his meaning. He and his brother would never fully understand one another. They were both constrained by the roles they were born to fill. He was grateful that deity made him the firstborn. He had responsibilities, but nothing like those his brother would inherit. Chapter 11, Strellaran. When Hieronymus neared the age of 30, he expressed his doubts about the succession and his place within the hierarchy. To settle the argument the 2 men were having, his brother, Hezekiah, picked up a strip of black dyed fabric discarded by the artisans and settled it over his right shoulder, knotting the ends together at his left hip. He told his brother, "I am your last resort, Hieronymus. It is my job to make sure that you keep grandfather's promise." He stroked the black fabric and continued, "This will be the mark of my office, so you will always know that I take my obligations seriously." That was the first time in our recorded history that the sash of office was used. It is now an integral part of our succession. Tremaine, Capitulo 10. Zacarian took a deep breath and said, "Father, I did want to speak with you and Amador about the future." He gestured to the bench, encouraging them to sit down. Zacarias studied his second son. He wore a robe reminiscent of the one that Sebastian was wearing when they first met, with long ornate sleeves and a simple braided cord around his waist. Once they were seated, Zacarian looked like he did not know how to broach whatever subject was on his mind. After a lengthy hesitation, he glanced at Amador and the 2 brothers exchanged a speaking look. Amador smiled and looked back at Zacarias. "We have been thinking, Father, about the future." Amador's voice had the strength of his self-appointed ecclesiastical calling. Not only the near future, but for all generations. Zacarian will be 30 on the 40th day before autumn. Zacarias could sense the tension in both of his sons. "As I have taught you, from the time you could first speak, this is the time when you must find your mate, and upon the eve of your birth anniversary, you must give your soul into her keeping." He addressed his remarks to Zacarian. "From all that you have told us, Father, it is a most wondrous experience. I look forward to that time, though I have not yet discovered the woman to keep my soul." "Your Kaylee," Amador corrected. He glanced at his father and said, "It is an apt word, is it not?" It was a pet name Zacarias called Estoliana, but many of those who came to live in Estolia considered it an official word, with a specific meaning. As Sebastian reminded him, all new languages begin from the seed of older ones, and it is a beautiful word, with, now, a beautiful new meaning, the keeper of a man's soul. Key and I even made a special symbol for it. "Your title, then, will be last resort? From now until Zacarian becomes king and his child is named and numbered among the Estolians, I am his last resort. Like you, I will be one of his counselors throughout his reign." His pause went on so long that Zacarias wondered if his son was having a conversation with deity, while the world around him turned immobile. When he did speak, his voice had that resonance of a proclamation from deity. "Once I have found my own Kaylee, on the eve of my 30th birthday, and have been in seclusion, on the 8th day my Kaylee and I will keep the soul of Estolia. We will be both solace and strength for the king, his children and all Estolians. And yours will be the ultimate authority for any disputes or difficulties." Zacarian's voice was rich with satisfaction. Do you not see, Father, what this means? Amador said earnestly, you, who began our nation, have been both king and keeper, but it has been a difficult position to hold. It is much better to split the roles you hold and give half of your responsibilities to each son. We will rule together, the shining Strellaran that Key inscribed on our flag. He gestured to the carved flag on the stone staircase. We are but 3 men. Why are there 4 Strellaran at the center of the flag? Zacarias asked. Zacarian jumped to his feet and approached the flag, raising his hand to point at the stars. When Amador and I have passed our burdens to my sons, my brother and I, and my 2 sons, will be the Strellaran of Estolia, the 4 men whose word is final, the ultimate authority, and those in whom the word of deity resides. What of those other stars? He gestured to the 2 stars on either side of the mountain peaks. Can you not guess, Father? Amador asked him rhetorically, before answering. The 2 on the left are representative of the rising generation, while the 2 on the right represent those who have come before. He pointed at his father. Deity has promised us never-ending prosperity, so long as we keep the promise I made. He got to his feet and the 3 men embraced. Zacarias was brought back to the present. His sons were waiting for his response to Amador's question. Kaylee is both apt and beautiful. He looked from one son to the other and then asked, What concerns you on this day, my sons? Amador spoke passionately. Estolia is new, without any set traditions. But we have the promises of deity that our nation will never fail. It is our responsibility to develop traditions, define roles, and establish the critical steps of the transition from one generation to the next. We must assure that our descendants have no doubts about their duties, nor the consequences of defiance. And you believe you know how the transition from one king. Zacarias tapped his chest before pointing to Zacarian. To the next must transpire? As he suspected, Amador had thought it through. He elaborated about his ideas, and when he was done speaking, Zacarias felt the familiar wash of warm approval coming from deity. Yes, Amador was inspired in his plans, and deity wanted to make sure that Zacarias knew it. What do you think about this, Zacarian? He asked his oldest son. It makes sense, father. You are still quite vigorous. You have frequently mentioned how important it has been for you to share your burdens with Sebastian and Key. Now that I am nearing 30 years, it is time for me to take on the role of king. Explain your interpretation of your brother's plan, he commanded his oldest son. I will find my Kaylee and give my soul into her keeping on my 30th birthday. We will be in seclusion for 7 days in the Spirit Grove, and at the end of those 7 days, we will seek the sanction of the Spirit. But you will not be king just yet? Zacarias asked. No, father, no man can be king without an heir. Deity has said that an heir will be born as the visible evidence that our exchange is approved, a son who will in his time, take on my role. 7 days after the birth of my son I will become the king of Estolia. You will be needed, father, to counsel Zacarian when necessary. Amador interjected. Zacarias turned to his second son and asked, And you, Amador, what process will your own succession take? I was born a year and 2 seasons after Zacarian, and it is important that I, too, find and give my soul into the keeping of my Kaylee before taking on the role of spiritual leader. Zacarian added, As a last resort, Amador is available should I suddenly sicken or die. Zacarias remembered the words of deity, saying that his second son was there, as a last resort, not only if illness should render his oldest son incapable of being king, but also in case Zacarian, or any heir chose to break the promise Zacarias made to deity. Chapter 12. Fishing. Antony was drawn to Estolia 10 years after Zacarias. His life was anchored in a love of the sea, and he established the township of Pirates' End. Once he settled in Estolia, he asked to return to his homeland, to the east beyond Manos and Palmyra, to ask his 3 brothers and their families to consider living in Estolia. Their boat-building skills were necessary, allowing for commerce between Estolia and her neighbors. Antony increased their knowledge of the sea and its denizens, explained that the Leviathan that Zacharias described in his earliest accounts was not, as Key had postulated, one of the Shober Aqus, a sword-toothed lizard and servant of the Egyptian god Sobek. It must have been one of the Zytheraphene, voracious monsters of the deep, capable of consuming an entire horse in minutes. Of course, we know now that the Shober Aqus is the Nile crocodile, and the Zytheraphene is a shark. Xavier Archimedes Zacarian, Capitulo 86. It was a perfect day to fish for Antuinia. Zacarian walked towards the bow of the Dia de Promessa. His birth anniversary was coming up fast. Amador suggested that they attempt to catch one of the big fish for the celebration feast. The wind was brisk as they set off from Pirates' End before dawn. The sun breasted the horizon just as they reached the open sea. The sunrise was typical, swiftly staining the shores of Pequeño and Corlia with reds and yellows and oranges. The colors were intensifying when the wind began to pick up. For the next half an hour, the ship flew across the water, heading due east. Marcan, Key's second son, was the captain of the Dia de Promessa. He was scanning the horizon anxiously. If this keeps up, we will be visiting Palmyra. Antony squinted up at the sun and sniffed the air, before he said, "Wind will slack soon." He returned his attention to the fishing net he was mending. Zacarian sat down out of the way of the sailors. He knew his own limitations. Sailing was one of his weakest skills. His brother did not look at all disturbed. He looked like he wanted nothing more than to be abducted by the wind. He felt smug satisfaction when he remembered that his was the advice that resulted in the lavish decorations adorning the robe that Amador was wearing. "Sebastian made me a robe," Amador said to him. "He says I may begin wearing it whenever I wish." "Why do you frown?" Zacarian asked. "Is this not one of your deepest desires?" Amador ran his hand over the smooth fabric, picking up one of the sleeves and then stroking the edges. "It should be purple and green, the colors which symbolize Estolia." A muscle in his jaw clenched, his chin jutting, his lips compressed with a line of white outlining them. Zacarian took it from Amador, looking at the fine workmanship. He had known of Sebastian's gift. Had watched him working on the hem with meticulous care. It was a light tan color, with a much darker thread used to embroider intricate patterns at each border. He thought about the dyes available to them. Green and purple were the most difficult colors. Attempts to make purple out of the easily available blue and red dyes resulted in disaster. When combined, they corrupted each other and ruined the item being dyed. They were able to create a green dye out of the rinds of mayberry fruit. But purple eluded them. "Have you noticed the island goats?" Zacarian asked his brother. "Recall the ones we brought to Promessa and think back to the contrast." They had offered to bring 6 island goats to Promessa and pick up a similar number to bring back to the palace. When the 6 mingled with the Promessa herd, the differences between them became very stark. The Promessa animals had, without exception, purple legs and bellies. They saw why when the near-white parts of the coats of the new animals turned brilliant purple after they waded across the Purple River. The water itself wasn't purple, but Zacarian had a theory that there was something about the natural oils of the goat hide that picked up the faint tracery of Tarsus dye in the water and intensified it. "Why do we not use the wool from the island goats kept near Promessa?" Amador followed up on his suggestion, and soon the artisans were tackling the problem. Zacarian frequently joined them as they experimented with different dyes, techniques, and ideas. His first idea, to soak the fabric in the Purple River, did not work. When he suggested that a new robe should be woven out of the purple wool, he was told that the garment would be too warm for most of their seasons. The solution, for the robes of office that his brother wished to wear, was focused more on dyeing the threads with which the robe could be adorned. Soon a variety of dyes were created, and the final effect was a beautiful abstract design bordering the robes, setting off the role and rank of the man wearing them. Amador designed an instructional system that would, in future generations, take place in the semi-subterranean temple. He pointed out that his robes should have all the colors they were able to create: dark brown, purple, and green threads. But those who were just beginning their studies, acolytes, should only have the green threads decorating their robes. Somewhere in between his own heavily embroidered robes and the simple design adorning the acolytes, they would have a robe decorated in purple and green to denote advanced learners' place in the hierarchy he was still developing. When Zacarian saw the final touches used for Amador's robe, however, he was impressed. One of the items that was recovered from the anchorman was a fine gold wire that could be used as if it was thread. The sleeves were bordered in the gold thread, denoting Amador's ultimate position as the religious and spiritual leader of the Estolian people. The artisans were now experimenting on fabrics and dyes, trying to come up with a more permanent dye. The first flag of Estolia was created by Estoliana and Mari, using fabrics that were among the cargo of the anchorman. But they wished to create a new one someday, using their ingenuity and intuition to come up with dyes that could be used for this purpose. All thoughts of fabric, dyes, goats, and robes died down with the wind. For the next hour they focused on the large school of Antuinia circling the Dia de Promessa as the wind turned breathless. Chapter 13. Rescue. One deliberate choice made by the earliest settlers of Estolia was to both use the abundant caves in Mount Zacarias, but to also limit their use. The full extent of the caves was never recorded. It was decided, in the interests of safety, that some would be walled off, to keep citizens from being lost and wandering aimlessly, seeking the light of day. Rumors of hidden treasures persist to this day, secrets left to be discovered within the depths of both mountains. Treasure troves of wisdom from our forebears, the exquisite crafts and riches that were the cargo of the anchorman. Phoebe Zacarian, Inscrito. As they landed their third and final Antuina, Zacarian heard a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck to stand up. A female voice, yelling, distressed. He and Amador both rushed to the far side of the sailboat, towards the horizon that was obscured by the sails. Another ship was traveling towards them. The colors of their flag indicated that it was Palmaran. More than half of the immigrants to Estolia originated in Palmara. Both Zacarian and Amador had learned the language from Sebastian. The smaller ship was parallel to theirs. The sailors worked to stop it from impacting their vessel. A woman ran along the deck, pursued by two sailors. She looked over her shoulder before climbing on the rail and diving into the swirling waters. Zacarian, alarmed, remembered the toothy fish that always accompanied Antuina. She will be consumed by the Zacarian. He ran towards the rail, while frantically scanning the water. Where was she? His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he held his breath, searching for any trace of her. There. He saw her. She couldn't swim. Several large fins were cutting the water in a straight line towards her. Without hesitation, he dropped his scabbard, pulled off his tunic, and climbed on the rail. Amador had enough time to say his name before he dove into the water. For Zacarian, his brother's words were not as important as saving this woman from certain death. She was struggling to stay afloat, clumsily, unskilled at swimming in the rough open sea. Her cries of distress were mixed with coughing as she swallowed seawater. The Antuina were thick here, and he hoped that the Zacarian would not be lurking too close. He embraced her just as her scream turned strident. He dove under the water, saw the Zacarian brushing against her, toying with its meal. He remembered Antony's advice: they are cowards, and will flee from any attack. He punched the pointed nose of the fish approaching him. The monster swam away but immediately began to circle back. Zacarian ignored it, focusing on trying to help the woman. He pushed her back to the surface, tilting her head back so she would not swallow any more water. Spluttering and coughing, she nearly drowned him as she tried to remain above the surface. Both ships were closing the distance to where he was treading water with the girl half supported by his body. Omador shouted instructions to him that he could not comprehend. He focused only on the task he set for himself. By the time the Palmyran ship reached them, Zacarian had to resort to kicking the Zacarian twice, his hands occupied with the woman. The third time he felt a raking pain on his calf and he was grateful to accept a hand up onto the other ship. Once on board, firm hands clapped over his injury. "You are bleeding badly," a cultured voice spoke to him in Palmyran. "Hold still while we try to stem the flow. Your rescue of my Novia must be rewarded." He tried to focus, but the sight of so much blood seeping around the fingers clasping his leg, coupled with the harrowing rescue, was one shock too many, and he passed out. When he regained consciousness, Omador and Markan were with him, treating his injury with the 3 soaps of cleanliness. While they worked, Zacarian sought to master his physical reactions, nausea and faintness, forcing himself to view the half-dozen triangular rips in his flesh. Silently, he thanked deity, knowing how voracious Zacarian could be. He was lucky to be alive. After his prayer of thanksgiving, he took in his surroundings. They were on the small Palmyran ship, the much larger Dia de Promesa alongside, the ships secured to one another. Zacarian looked for the woman he saved. One man had the aura of power surrounding him, and, as Markan finished bandaging his leg, he approached. The stranger wore a dull red over-tunic. It was newly fashionable to use the reds and yellows of certain fruits to dye lips and cheeks with bright unnatural coloring, employing chalk to create a contrasting pale base color. This man embraced these affectations. His beard was shaped around his mouth with his cheeks and jawline free of whiskers. His hat was adorned with several feathery plumes that must have come from a willow. Zacarian asked him in Palmyran, "Where is the woman?" "My betrothed is quite safe. I extend to you gratitude for your swift action. I fear she would have perished if you did not act so quickly to save her life." His smile did not reassure Zacarian. "I am Esteban, son of Madrigal, of Palmyra. This is my vessel, named Cinderellan. I am Omador and this is my brother, Zacarian. We are the sons of Zacarias and Estoliana," his brother stated. "And the woman I rescued?" Zacarian ignored the courtesy his brother tried to inject into the conversation. "She is safe. Secure. Attended by her maid. I am indebted to you for your quick actions." His voice was oily, his demeanor suspect. "She screamed and jumped into the water," he contradicted. "She was frightened. I must see her, ascertain her safety." Chapter 14. Ascelina. I was puzzled by the structure of Estolia from the very beginning. My father made certain that I mingled with the most elevated of society while I was still in England, and the skills that he taught me came in quite useful once I was living in Estolia. But I was still confused by some of the events that took place. I recall how proud the king was when he announced that his youngest daughter would be marrying the man who cared for the massive pond and fountain in front of the palace, and who directed the efforts of half a dozen other workers in keeping the beautiful grounds well groomed. I could think of no other nation where a princess might marry a gardener or groundskeeper and have this illicit joy and happiness in all who heard of the forthcoming nuptials. Estolia had a way of turning most of my preconceptions back in on themselves. Charlotte Zacarian, Ensayo 85. Esteban's first reaction to Zacarian's statement was a tightening of his lips and a narrowing of his eyes. Though he did not relax, his voice had a superficial joviality when he said, "But of course, after your injury, it is only natural that you would wish to be assured of her safety and health. I shall require her to thank you, and to set your mind at ease prior to your return to your ship." When she approached, Zacarian got to his feet. She walked slowly, hesitantly, warily. He had to blink several times as his vision kept blurring. She came to a halt a step behind the other man, and waited. Next to him, Omidor's stance and voice were formal. "Allow me the pleasure of introducing my older brother. Zacarian, firstborn son of Zacharias and Estoliana." Zacarian couldn't take his eyes off the woman. Her hair was still wet, but she had changed out of her wet dress. When Esteban swept his flamboyant, feather-bedecked hat off his head, she jerked away from him, like a poorly broken horse shying away from an upraised hand. With a bow, the other man said, "I am Esteban, only son of Madrigal, de Palmara. This is Ascelina, my bride-to-be. This is our matrimonial cruise. Thanks to your swift action, the ceremony to make her mine will go forward as planned." Before Zacarian could formally greet the woman, another man stepped forward, standing between Zacarian and the lovely Ascelina. He was dressed in dark tunic and breeches. In addition to the sword in a scabbard, he had 2 leather straps crossing his chest, and each one sported a well-worn sheath with a dagger. Both straps and sheaths showed a significant amount of wear. He also had what Antony described as nervous fingers, always active, the sign of a man who was expert in the use of his preferred weapons. Unlike Esteban, whose sword and scabbard looked ornamental, this man was proficient. "This is Petros. He has many talents, he will perform the nuptial ceremony." Zacarian ignored the introduction. "Ascelina has no intention of being your mate, she has told you this. As a gentleman, you must honor her wishes." He spoke with certainty, seeing confirmation in the way her eyes widened. Esteban's amiable expression was wiped off his face, and his jaw jutted angrily. "You are as nothing." He lifted one wrist and flicked an invisible speck off the sleeve of his overtunic. His voice conveyed equal parts amusement and disdain. "As is your opinion on the topics of honor and gentlemanly behavior." A smirk lifted one corner of his mouth. "It would seem that you have overstayed your welcome here upon my vessel." Zacarian moved so swiftly, Esteban did not react in time to stop him. He crossed the distance that separated them, and pulled Ascelina away from the other man, thrusting her into his brother's arms. He did not have time to marvel at the sensations rushing through his system at her magical touch. His focus was on the man bristling at him, his expression ugly, feral. His tone was fierce when he said, "Ascelina will come with us." Esteban's hand settled on the hilt of his sword, and he growled dissent, saying, "I think not. If you do not leave my ship, I shall have you and your brother thrown over the side and fed to the beasts of the sea." Zacarian slid in front of Ascelina. His brother would support him. Esteban, with his brightly dyed clothing and painted face, was the type of man who hired others for the skills they themselves were too lazy to master. His hands were soft, with no calluses of honest toil. Zacarian would defeat Esteban if he was fool enough to draw his sword. He remained alert. Petros, the man at Esteban's side, was not a man to ignore. There were only 4 other men on the deck, and the small sailboat could not boast more than 4 or 5 additional men. The Dia de Promesa, by contrast, was more than twice the size of this ship, and had at least 3 times the number of men. "We are leaving," he said. He half-turned and gestured to the lovely woman that she should precede him to the planks that had been used as a hasty method of moving from one ship to the other. The sound of Esteban pulling his sword out of its scabbard was loud, echoing across the water. By the time Zacarian turned back, the sound was followed by the sailors of both ships all pulling their swords. He focused on Esteban and said, his voice soft, "You would not prevail. You and your men would be slaughtered." The honking of a few willow-owls flying overhead seemed to break up the tableau, and at a gesture, the other man slid his sword back into its scabbard, with his men following his example. Omidor gestured towards their ship, and 4 of their sailors crossed over to escort Ascelina to their ship. When Zacarian was the only Estolian left on the Palmaran ship, Esteban's voice rang out, "That one has been harlot to half the sailors in Palmara. She will deceive you like she deceived me." Zacarian's rebuttal was swift. First she was your betrothed, and then she was a harlot. Either you are a fool, planning to marry a harlot, or you, sir, are a liar, unable to speak only truth. I am no fool, and I know better than to accept the word of either fool or liar. He turned his back on the flamboyant man, leaping up to balance on the plank. Ascelina's high-pitched scream was his only warning, and he instinctively turned back. The knife that Petros threw, aimed at his back, missed its target, lodging in his left upper arm. He grabbed his arm and toppled the rest of the way onto the deck of the Dia de Promessa. The wind, breathless half an hour before, chose that moment to rise. The Estolian sailors had already raised the anchor, and with the return of the wind, their boat pulled away from the other ship. Zacarian staggered to the central mast and gripped it with his left hand. He reached for the dagger but was stopped by an authoritative voice. Don't. It was Ascelina speaking. Petros threw the knife. He boasts that his daggers nearly always take the life of the man they touch. He stores them in oil of pigweed seeds. The wound will not heal. Amador stepped close, his hands clasped. What is to be done then? She came over to where Zacarian was slowly sinking down to the deck, his back supported by the mast. She reached down and tore a strip of fabric from her skirt, saying, "The Azulano," she waved to the recent catch of Anchoina. "I need a fillet of the flesh, of this size." She demonstrated the size she wanted with her hands. She added something else that did not translate well. Rather than try to explain, she merely went to the nearest fish and then held her hand out to Amador, who gave her a blade. She gutted the fish, carving a fillet and pulling some obscure organ from within the body cavity. Once back at his side, she pulled a small glass vial from between her breasts. It hung on a slender chain. It is a miracle that there are the ingredients for the remedy all here upon the ship. Seawater, this substance, and the flesh of Anchoina. Is not seawater full of contaminants? Amador asked her. The salt neutralizes the evil essence of pigweed, she said. Zacarian watched the discussion between Ascelina and Amador and felt the warm, comforting embrace of deity. He would survive. There was no other possibility when deity promised them prosperity. He studied the shifting glow surrounding her while Amador explained to her the soaps of cleanliness. When she pulled the dagger from his arm, he bellowed at the sudden agony rushing from the injury to his fingertips as the air interacted with the poison. Nor could he contain the sigh of bliss as the flesh of the fish soothed the pain. "The ship from Palmyra matches us," Markan said to them. Amador took charge, in a way that Zacarian recognized would be typical throughout their reign. They cannot thread the needle without coming to grief. He was referring to the hazardous inlet to the inner bays. Even if he does not damage his ship in the exchange inlet, he'll invariably choose Graveyard Bay. It is to be hoped that his men will recognize the danger and take him away from our shores. He will not give up. Ascelina looked up from where she was working on binding his wound. Markan did not sound disturbed at her assertion. "He cannot catch us, his ship is no match for ours. Have no fear, princess, that he will reclaim you." For Zacarian there was something significant in Markan calling her princess, but before he could figure it out, he had to close his eyes as the world began to whirl around him. Chapter 15. Facets of Soul. I asked my father why it was that nearly all references to deity exclude gender. The ensayo of Estoliana and the words of Zacarias are very clear that deity is female. But after that there are very few references to gender. I think I frustrated him by having trouble grasping the significance of his response. He told me that, despite the deeply significant differences in gender, here in the leadership of Estolia, it is, nevertheless, immaterial that deity is female. You are, after all, no more or less capable, intelligent, or worthy based upon your gender. It is best to always focus on what makes you unique and capable, and that has nothing to do with your body and everything to do with yourself and soul. Emerald Zacarian, inscrito. Zacarian opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was his parents, looking haggard and drawn. He had never once thought of his father or mother as old, but they certainly looked like they had aged a tremendous amount since he last saw them. When was that? Where was he? Next, Mari and Key were there by his side. He wanted to demand an explanation, but when he opened his mouth, nothing but a subdued croak came out. Mari had a square of absorbent fabric, felted from a combination of the fine wool of lambs and the seed fuzz of Tarsus weed. She dipped the fabric in a cup. While the pale amber-colored liquid slowly saturated the square of felt, Zacarian began to crave the beverage with an intensity he could never remember feeling. "It is Mayberry blossom tea," Mari said. "It is mild and flavored with honey and sweetgrass seed." Warm feminine hands supported his head and helped him to suckle on the square of fabric. He wondered why they did not just allow him to drink from the cup. The warm hands holding him were not his mother's. Who was it? But his thirst was so extreme that he could focus on nothing until he slaked it. "You have been very ill," Mari said. "You must drink slowly or you will vomit and be more starved of liquid than before." It was good advice. What exactly happened? His voice was hoarse and barely recognizable. Several pillows were pushed under his head and shoulders. A woman entered his field of vision. She was blurry. Was his illness coming back? "What is it?" Amador asked him, speaking in Estolian. They had been speaking Palmaran. Zacarian answered, "I do not wish to alarm anyone, brother, but I am seeing double images." "Right now?" Amador asked him. Zacarian shook his head slightly. His brother was not blurry. He looked back at Ascelina. She was still out of focus, alluring, arousing. "When I look at this woman, it is as if I see her thrice at once. But it is only her. Why should my illness make her, and only her, blurry to me? Tomorrow, my brother, is the eve of your birthday. Can you think of a reason that a woman might appear so strange to you?" "The aura." Of course. It was nothing like the aura of his mother, which his father described as a golden shimmering glow. But now that he knew what he was seeing, he had no doubts. "Where am I?" Zacarian glanced around. They were in a tent. Amador answered him in Palmaran. "When the Dia de Promesa docked at Pirate's End, Ascelina warned us that your illness was accelerating, and worried that if we insisted on traveling to the palace, you might die. We diverted to the Spirit Grove and established a camp. We have been tending you for the last 5 days. Ascelina said that you would wake on this day. She is a gifted healer." Zacarian looked at the woman he'd rescued from Azitharafin. This was the woman who would keep his soul. His Kaylee, his everything. As the implications sank in, the aura, shimmering like a dozen images out of focus, began to change before his eyes. Each of the images swelled to the size of the largest, until there was only one slightly larger transparent image overlapping her. It began to shrink until it settled over her, like the waters of the purple river would coat a lamb wading across it for the first time. And then the extra image was gone, leaving only this beautiful, extraordinary woman. "Will you be mine?" he blurted out, stumbling over the words he didn't even know that he knew. She looked from Sebastian to Amador before her beautiful eyes returned to his, acceptance shining. Chapter 16. Spirit Grove. Prior to the creation of the seclusion suites in the temple, the Spirit Grove was the ideal place for Estolians to go for their seclusion. Quiet, beautiful, and mystical, it was, and still is, a place where anyone can step away from the stresses and strains of modern life and go back to a simpler time. Many Estolians believe that it is easier to speak with, and be heard by, deity from within the Spirit Grove than most other places in Estolia. Meredith Zacarian, History of Estolia. The next day, as the sun sank towards the horizon, the two brothers walked through the Spiritwood forest. Zacarian used the carved wooden cane Amador had fashioned for him. The shark bite on his calf was only just beginning to take on the glow of healthy healing. Both wounds had been serious, and it was only the skill and quick thinking of Ascelina that kept him alive. Once it is full dark, Amador said to him, "You are free to be alone with and claim your Kaylee." Zacarian stopped and their eyes met. "What will it be like?" "I heard Father once say that, while incomprehensible to contemplate yielding up your soul, when it actually happens it is like the pleasure of that first moment, coupling with the woman you love, when her body takes yours in, surrounded by the grip of purity and innocence, filled with the pleasure of knowing her. It is as if your body remains wedded to hers, that warmth of intimacy with you for the rest of your life." "I shall have to share my impressions with you after seclusion," Zacarian said. Sebastian and Key both believe it is essential we record everything of note in our lives, so that our descendants might learn from us and keep Father's promise to deity. Anxious, Zacarian asked, "You are sure that tomorrow is the anniversary of my birth?" He did not wish to jeopardize the land his father had spent his life building up. "Yes, Zacarian, I am certain. Once the sun has fully set, so that no glimmer of sunlight remains, you are free to place your soul in Ascelina's keeping. She will be your Kaylee, and she will bring a son to grace your alliance." As they waited for the sun to set, Zacarian blurted out, "How can I be sure that she is right for me?" He knew only that Ascelina had shown him her aura. Father promised deity that his children, particularly his firstborn son, would keep his word. Has it never occurred to you what that means? When Zacarian would have responded, Amador shook his head and answered his own question. "It means that you, as the heir, have less freedom when it comes to your future, both in what you do and who you marry. You cannot simply study the dyes of Promessa, or the production of fabrics. Nor do you marry at your own leisure. You must accept that deity will select your Kaylee and that it is your duty to give your soul into her keeping upon this night, and, in 7 days, receive confirmation that your union is accepted." They were quiet for some time. It was only after he finished bathing and dressing that Amador asked him, "Are you unhappy with Ascelina as your Kaylee?" Zacarian remembered the glow of her aura, and the warmth of her expression. All other considerations aside, he desired her, wanted her with an acute need. "She fascinates me, draws me in. I do not think I could deny her, even if she tempted me to break Father's promise." Amador touched the new bandage on the healing wound to his upper arm. "Perhaps this is why you sustained this injury, as deity knows your strengths and weaknesses, and would not give you a temptation beyond your ability to withstand. Deity will always look out for us in this way." The two brothers heard several wind instruments and their eyes met. It was time for Zacarian to meet his destiny and fulfill his father's promise, thus securing the happiness, safety, and health of his people. When Ascelina walked towards him, Zacarian did not remember any of his misgivings or questions. Her aura danced around her, in it he could see her emotions, joy, happiness, love, amusement, and mother love. He had a vision of a baby cradled in her arms, lips at her breast, a smile gracing her beautiful mouth. He walked towards her slowly, drinking in that and other visions, his eyes never leaving hers. When he extended his hand to her, she took it without hesitation. Heat spread from their joined hands as he pulled her into his arms, each point of contact stoking the flames within them. He brushed his lips against hers for several heartbeats, everything else faded in the background. It was only the sound of a throat being cleared that reminded him that they were not alone. The sun was racing towards the edge of the world, but it was not yet down. "Come," Zacarias spoke into the silence. "We have a delightful meal that we will share." He gestured to where a feast had been set out on the natural table created by one of the fallen spiritwood trees. Throughout the meal, Zacarian was focused on the beautiful Ascelina. She spoke of her father, sister, and brothers with love, explained that she was moved to seek out Pequeño after the Divinatra told her it held her destiny. Whatever happened to the Cinderellan? He asked her. This was the first time he thought of the ship that brought her to him. It had been pursuing the Dia de Promesa when he passed out. "As your brother predicted," Ascelina said, "the ship was wrecked." She looked grim. "The Zetharafin were pacing us. We saved 4. Hanith, my maid, 2 sailors, and Esteban." "What happened then?" Zacarian asked. He had been in the Spirit Grove since their return. "They are still here. Esteban will be returned to Palmyra, I am told." "And the 2 sailors? Your maid?" Her smile was so beautiful, he had trouble interpreting her response. Eventually the meaning of her words settled into his mind. "Hanith asks to remain. As do the 2 sailors. They have been welcomed and numbered among Estolians. Esteban does not ask to remain, and I do not think he would have been welcome." "What will happen with him?" he asked. He had mixed feelings about the man. His actions, however diabolical, had brought him his Ascelina. "Amador insists, and your father agrees, that Esteban must return to Palmyra where the Septenatro and my father will be told of his actions. He will be sanctioned. The ownership of his estate is in dispute. If he loses his lands, as he has lost his crew and his ship, then he will lose everything. I have asked that my letter to my father precede Esteban's return. The Dia de Promesa will depart for Palmyra the day after we come out of seclusion." Satisfied that justice would be served, Zacarian was distracted by the beautiful woman across from him. His eyes met hers, and he took in the rosy glow of her cheeks, the shifting facets of her aura, and the swell of her breasts. Chapter 17. Zacarian. By the end of the 3rd capitulo, Hieronymus declared that all Estolians from that point onward would have some measure of the blood of Zacarias in their veins. Inspired by his words, I decided to test them for my research project. When the display cases in the keeper's office were destroyed, much was recovered, including 3 packages labeled as the baby teeth from the first 3 kings of Estolia after Zacarias. I extracted sufficient genetic material from them to sequence the DNA. Every Estolian I tested demonstrated some familial link with Zacarias. Serenity Barlow Zacarian, inscrito. The feast seemed to go on forever. Zacarian's attention was centered on Ascelina to the exclusion of everything else. When Amador spoke to him, he looked away from her reluctantly, only then noticing that the clearing was empty. The remnants of the feast were gone, and the darkness was near complete beyond the circle of light cast by the dwindling bonfire. Amador settled a dish of fruit next to 2 goblets of Danieli wine. He recognized the fruit instantly, the poisonous fruit of Mayberry. In the darkness, Amador's voice was strong, assertive. "The Mayberry is a gift from deity. Yes, everyone knows this. We use it to make purple dye. The blossoms flavor the honey of Estolian bees, and the perfume sells well in Palmyra and Izquierdo, and the tea is popular with all Estolians. Sebastian tells me that the third soap of cleanliness was much improved by adding mayberry wood ash. But, brother, only willowalls and island goats eat the fruit, Zacarian said. If they can eat it, it is not poisonous. The fruit, like everything you mentioned, is a gift from deity to the children of Zacharias. Share the flesh of a single fruit with your bride. Have faith in me, and in deity. Omador moved away swiftly, stopping next to his horse. When he turned back, he said, I will be here in the morning with food so that you may break your fast. He mounted and cantered away before Zacarian could ask him any other questions. What is it? Ascelina asked. He and his brother had spoken in Estolian. I apologize for not using your language, he said to her. My brother tells me that this fruit is a gift from deity. She reached for one orange-red segment and picked it up, extending it to him. He forgot what she was feeding him, as her hand neared his mouth. All he could see was the promise of eternity with her. He reached for her hand and helped guide it to his mouth, so that she could place the fruit upon his tongue. Swiftly, so that they might both partake together, he offered her a piece as well and, as one, they bit into the small fruit in their mouths. The thought of eternity with her was submerged beneath the jolt of sensation and flavor as the juices of the mayberry fruit burst upon his palate, washing through him like the inrushing tide. They each picked up one of the last two pieces and shared them, eyes closed to enjoy the sensation. Afterwards they sipped the wine, which was the finest that he had ever tasted. The glow of warmth and desire spread from the tingle on his tongue to the taut skin of his thighs. Ascelina, in her simple white tunic, was everything any man could desire for his Kaylee. They stood up, embraced, his lips settled over hers once more. The taste of the wine and the fruit on her lips and tongue increased his desire. They kissed and caressed and moved together, and when he pulled back slightly, they were in the tent, standing next to the luxurious bed readied for them. You are certain, Ascelina, that this is what you want? Zacarian asked her. He had to be sure. To be my Kaylee. The keeper of my soul? My everything? Will you be mine, and take me as yours? Her smile was glorious, made even more beautiful by the dusky flush upon her cheeks that was only barely visible in the candlelight. My destiny is here in Estolia, with you, Zacarian. I knew this to be true from the time I was a very little girl. I told my father I would find my fortune and future on Pequeño. She pushed the straps of her dress off her shoulders, the entire garments slipped off her body. Zacarian pulled his own garments off. She had thick black hair curling halfway down her back, amber-colored eyes, and a beautiful wide mouth. Her shoulders were broad and her breasts were full, the peaks rigid, the convex curvature of her abdomen leaving the dark triangle at the juncture of her thighs shadowed, mysterious. He took her into his arms, his lips settling on hers as he guided her to the bed. The scent of mayberry blossoms, taste of mayberry fruit, the intoxicating glow of the Danieli. None of these could compete with the feel of her skin, smooth as the surface of the water in a lake on a still night, her scent, rich and musky, or the sight of her orange-brown eyes, half-lidded with passion. When he could no longer hold back, he sank within her warm embrace. From his first memory, his father spoke of the promise he made to deity, the role that Zacarian would play in the safety of Estolia. Now he understood why his father urged him to keep the promise, give his soul to Ascelina. There were no words in Enochian, Palmaran, or Estolian to describe the sensation of his soul settling within her keeping, his heart surrounded by the intimacy of her love, his body enveloped by hers. Nothing on earth compared. He wondered if there was anything in Horizon that could be half as glorious, other than the shore paradise of spending all of time and eternity with this woman by his side. He cried out with her as pleasure washed over his body, feeling her clenching him tight, pleasuring and pleasured. Chapter 18. Ratification. Before I came to Hath, I did not comprehend the lure of status, power and prestige. I believed that halting the destruction of our fragile ecosystem would become a priority once they understood what type of world they would be giving to their children and grandchildren. But the quest for power was much stronger than the desire to give a beautiful, unsullied world to their descendants. With maturity, I considered the hundreds, thousands or more parents who do the most heinous things to their children. I am certain they rationalize their actions when the lure of power and profit overcomes the gentler emotions of parental love. Just considering such things made me weep. Zacarian had to comfort me in my distress. The only cure for the black despair that threatened to consume me was to work with him to fight against this evil that would usurp the rights of all children to live in a pristine world. Lioness of Hath, Personal Journal. Zacarias helped Estolia into her saddle and then paused, his hand on her thigh. The beautiful twisted trees of the Spirit Grove made this the ideal location for seclusion. Peace and fulfillment, he thought, were the two words that best summarized how he felt. He swung up into the saddle and they both turned their steeds towards home. I believe that Ascelina will be a wonderful queen. Estolia's voice was rich with satisfaction. They discussed their son's Corlia, and the future of their land, and arrived at their home before they had exhausted the topic. Estolia, with streaks of white at each temple, and the lines, spots, and wrinkles that time had inscribed upon her flesh, was still the most beautiful woman in the world. She was his constant companion, sleeping by his side nearly every night since the Anchor Moon foundered off the southern coast. They had been together fully half of his life, more than half of hers. When they dismounted, Zacarias extended his hand to her and together they entered their home. "My Corlia, did you find what you sought when you set out for Pequeño?" he asked her. It was rhetorical, but she answered anyway. "Oh no, Zacarias. I did not find what I sought. I sought safety from my father's choices, but what I found was a paradise greater than any storyteller could explain or describe. I found love more beautiful than any ever before experienced. Though I knew it not, I found horizon here upon our waking world. I found you, Zacarias." He extinguished the candles before leading her to their bed. Sebastian entered the future ceremony room and looked around. The stalagmite had been removed. It had dominated the chamber when he, and Zacarias first discovered it, that he expected to feel an emptiness once it was removed. But the stump of the rock formation, now converted fully into a religious dais, looked and felt right. As if this was always the plan deity had. The tiers around the periphery would take many years to carve out. But the dais was now a solid surface upon which future Estolians could hold sacred ceremonies until time itself ceased. In a few hours, they would hold the ceremony on the steps leading to the entrance of the temple. When Zacarian and Omador discussed their plans for ceremony of succession, Sebastian felt peace settle over his soul. Deity approved. When Zacarian and his beautiful Corlia arrived, they climbed the stone steps to where Zacarias stood with Amador to one side. Zacarian chose to stand one step lower than Ascelina, with her directly in front of him, leaning back against him. His hands rested over her abdomen, and his cheek pressed against hers. When Zacarias stepped forward, the crowd grew silent. He raised his voice so that all who were present could hear him. "When I came to Estolia, I promised deity that I would take Estolia to be my Corlia, the keeper of my soul. That I would wed her in 7 days, and be ever faithful to her until time itself ceased to be. I have been true to my word, and in turn, deity has kept every promise made to me, large and small. We have raised the next generation of Estolians to be literate and aware of my promise." He looked at his son. "Zacarian, as my firstborn son, you have now reached the age of 30, the age that deity required you to wed. What have you to say to your king and to the citizens of Estolia?" "I, Zacarian, he whose burdens and blessings are greatest in the light and sight of deity, hereby proclaim that I have taken the purity of Ascelina, daughter of Corlia of Palmyra. She came to me willingly, and has taken my soul within her keeping. She has consented to be my Corlia, my wife, my queen, my everything. We come here this day to be joined, to fulfill your promise to deity, and to bring into this world, in the proper time, a son to seal the exchange and to be our future king. We seek the blessings of the Spirit, that all we do might be accepted and our future prosperity both as a couple and as a nation be assured. Could Ascelina really be the daughter of Corlian? Sebastian studied the face of the future queen, raptly noting similarities to his beloved Corella. The morning light changed subtly. It was as if mist was shrouding the sun, but he could see no mist, no source of the sudden muting of the world around him. A warm hand grasped his. Corella. At his side, looking at him, love shining in her eyes. Is this not a most satisfactory conclusion to our story? She gestured towards Zacarian and Ascelina, as immobile as Key's statue of Zacharias. Is this to horizon, then? No. There is one more thing you must do before we can be together. Yearning to be with her now, not some distant point in the future, he asked, what is it? She only smiled. A different voice answered his question. Can you not guess, Sebastian, what final duty remains to tie you to mortality? Deity. Dressed like the other Estolian women enjoying the celebration. The answer was suddenly obvious. The coronation. He looked back at Corella and said softly, I must remain, to be a part of the coronation, to see Ascelina's son born. Deity's voice echoed through his heart and mind, the lineage of kings in Estolia will always be as much yours, Sebastian, as it will be Zacharias.